I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
This week we're talking with Ember Kelly, or you might know her as @CommieTheology on Twitter. A lot of really good hot takes and also a lot of very good pictures of China and Vietnam lately. So that's worth following for that alone, I think. Really excited to talk to her about her experience in the weird world of evangelicalism and also her experience sort of working through communism and coming out on the other side, I guess, by moving to a communist country. Lots of really neat stuff ahead. Before we do that, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. One, if you don't remember from last week or didn't listen to that episode yet, I'm going to teach a class at the Institute for Christian Studies in January. I can say more about it at the very, very end, but just flagging that because it's coming up real soon and you can register for it starting this week and it is super cheap. I think it's like $90 Canadian and it's all online, so you can do it from wherever you want and make some good Christian communist friends reading some really cool stuff together.
Great, let's get into it. Hey, so this week we're talking with Ember Kelly about her experience in China and Vietnam and probably some other stuff too. So Ember, for people who don't know who you are or what you're about, can you just give us a brief intro and tell us what you're kind of about, who you are, what you're interested in, etc.
Yeah, so my name is Ember Kelly. Some may know me from Twitter as CommieTheology, a screen name that I chose quite a while ago. I am a recent graduate of Chicago Theological Seminary, just graduated this last May. And during my time there, I got interested in communism. That's the 2-second version. But I began to research Marxism-Leninism and research communism a bit more. And during my time there, started to do some work in terms of thinking about the intersections of theology and revolutionary socialism. And I think that a lot of that was trying to push beyond just a typical liberal sort of liberation theology. I think some of the liberation theology in the U.S. gets stuck in very liberal politics. But since then, I've developed a major interest in Asian socialism and particularly the works of Liu Shaoqi, who wrote How to Be a Good Communist, and also Juche theology, Juche and theology, thinking of Juche out of the DPRK. So a pretty wide variety of interest. And for now, having graduated from seminary in May, and that was actually my second time through seminary, I have taken a little bit of a theology sabbatical and have been teaching abroad. But also that's given me a chance to get firsthand experience living in communist countries.
Nice. Thanks for that. That's a really great summary of some cool stuff that you're about. There is a ton that we want to ask you about. So we thought maybe we would divide the episode into 2 parts and just sort of take it in chunks, and we'll see. I mean, probably that will not be a very clean division, but we'll do our best. So first we're going to get to all the communism stuff in a minute here. But also we were interested in hearing a little bit about your experience as a trans person, both in Christian communities and in communist communities. So maybe we'll talk about some issues surrounding that first in the first half, and then we'll talk about communism after. So, anything kind of really significant jump out to kind of lead us into that conversation for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, half of my journey to communism and looking at communism and theology started as being like a trans person talking about theology on Twitter, and then I had all sorts of nice, respectable followers on Twitter back then, and I was always talking about like being a trans woman and trying to pursue a call towards ordination. And then I started following more and more radical people on Twitter during different social movements, especially like the Baltimore uprising. And right around that time, I started following a few communists on Twitter, and then it just kind of went downhill from there. But I think being a trans woman in Christian circles is part of what radicalized me, that I realized that just fighting for a little bit of change was not quite enough. And especially coming from also a really evangelical background, I still saw many of the same issues that I had with acceptance as a trans woman in evangelical background. I saw many of the same issues still being there in many liberal circles, but that they were just kind of covered over, like, we just got to respect everybody's opinion. That being trans has really radically affected my journey theologically and in terms of socialism.
Yeah, I'm really curious to maybe dig in a little bit further into the evangelical stuff in particular, because I know that you lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan for a little bit, and I lived there for a while as well. And people might know Grand Rapids as Betsy DeVos country. I guess that's kind of what it's known for these days. But it's also something like an evangelical gravity well in the United States. So there's a ton of like publishers there, like Zondervan or Erdmans or Baker, and there's like a mess of Dutch Reformed people that live there. And you also spent some time at Kuyper College, you were telling me earlier, which is pretty crazy because now I go to a Christian Reformed school as well. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that whole situation and maybe retrospectively, how has all of your more recent experience sort of shed light on some of those experiences you've had living in such a like weird Christian saturated kind of place?
Yeah, so actually even prior to ending up in the Mecca of Reformed Christianity of Grand Rapids, before that, before Reformed Christianity, I had even more interesting background. My family jumped around from like a Nazarene church to a Baptist church, and then to a non-denominational church, which was really just a Baptist church. But then at the same time, I was also attending a Pentecostal elementary, middle, and high school. It was with an Assemblies of God. It was an Assemblies of God related school. They were the ones that funded it. And so I had lots and lots of different Christianity exposure during my time. And so right around the end of high school, I started dating someone who was Christian Reformed, and that's really the only way that Reformed Christianity gains new converts, is marrying them in or giving birth to them. So I started going to a Christian Reformed church, and it really appealed to me because it was kind of, the opposite of this Pentecostal and Baptist-y hyper-emotionalness that I had grown up with. And, I was very much on the search for like more logical answers and was not really ever finding those besides just like read your Bible and God will speak to you. And I was like, okay, but I want some real answers to these tough questions that I'm asking. But I mean, at the same time, it really influenced me. I was in like 8th grade and wrote like a letter to the editor for our local newspaper about why evolution was evil. So I was, really wholesale had bought into Christian theology, but at the same time was having trouble finding some answers and some doubts. And I think in the back of my mind, struggling with being trans was part of that. And I thought, maybe if I could just find like a Christianity that has all the answers, I'm going to feel better about this. And Christian reformedness seemed to have a little bit more history. They could at least point to like John Calvin and Augustine, so Jesus, Paul, Augustine, John Calvin, apostolic succession of the Reformed faith. So I was excited. I was also super obsessed with history as like a high schooler. So it just felt a little bit deeper and a little bit more like there might be the answers here. And pretty much not too long after I started reading, Reformed theology, and I joined the Christian Reformed Church, and then started reading Catholic books, kind of on accident. I picked one up at the library just because I thought it looked interesting. And so while I headed off to go to a Reformed Bible College, as it was called, and then it became Kuyper College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And as I was headed there, I'm reading these books about Catholic stuff, and I got introduced to a local Catholic priest in Grand Rapids, and I started going to a Catholic church. And by the end of my first year at Reformed Bible School, I was Catholic. So then, I knew that I had found the one real church, and that it was going to have all the answers, but it turned out that wasn't really the case either. So looking back, I think it was perhaps a last-ditch attempt to stay in the closet too. Like I was sort of coming to terms by then with the fact that I was trans, and being more open with myself about it. But I think I thought that, with Hail Marys and Our Fathers and rosaries, that I might be able to pray myself away from the temptation of being trans. That maybe, just maybe, this would be the solution. But it turned out not to really be the case. And then by the end of my sophomore year of time at Kuyper, so that was about 2008, I was starting to actually come out of the closet. I came out to a therapist and to my family. And then I started dating someone who I'm now married to, and I came out to her, and started really just coming out to all of my friends. So by then it was, kind of cat's out of the bag. And I was still sticking with the Catholic thing. We got married in a Catholic church. But it was, as much as I loved so many things about the Catholic Church that I thought were really great, and some nice, cool theology, like with the Eucharist and things like that. I couldn't be, tithing to an organization where the funds went to like explicitly political stuff to oppose LGBT rights. So that kind of ended any sort of desire to remain Catholic, and I jumped to the Lutheran Church, and spent a little time there before in the ELCA. I met with someone to talk about, oh, hey, what if I want to be a pastor? It seems you're okay with trans pastors. And they were like, well, is this going to be something you talk with your congregants about? And I was like, that's not really a good start to this whole conversation. And so I took a little break, and then I ended up joining the UCC, which is where I've settled into now, though realistically living abroad. Haven't really figured out the church situation yet. But I settled into the UCC, and that's how I ended up going to Chicago Seminary. So that's my very abbreviated life theological / coming out journey. Just for perhaps maybe you got some questions from there, so we can head into a specific area instead of just a rabbit hole of keeping going about everything.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for just kind of sharing all of that with us. I think it's
I really love hearing people's stories and about just like how they get to be the people they are. And it's really lovely. Dean and I both have sort of like some evangelical stuff in our background. And I know for me, it has been, I think, largely a negative influence on my life. I don't know. Evangelicalism has a lot of really weird things going on with it, especially with regards to gender and sexuality. In a previous episode, we talked about how bad kissing, dating, goodbye is. Yeah.
That brings back high school.
Yeah. Lots of definitely gives me some the shakes again. Anyways, how do you think evangelicalism, as someone who's kind of run the gambit of religious stuff, how does evangelicalism shape people's sexuality and sexual identities, or at least how do you think that it shaped yours?
Yeah, it's a big question. Recently, I had a conversation with Roland Bohr of Marxist theology fame, and we talked about shared sort of backgrounds in theological circles, and he talked a lot about trying to understand and also own a little bit of the influence that it had on you, which I've always thought was interesting because, especially for me, evangelicalism just has so much negative baggage. Like, I look at these people that are like still, they're trying to be like liberal evangelicals. Like, I'm an open-minded evangelical. Like, and that to me is just like, I just don't understand like why even stick with that label. Like, 'cause it's just got so much baggage for me. And I mean, like the school the Pentecostal school that I went to, like, we prayed for George W. Bush in the Iraq War, and we prayed, against the gay agenda trying to take over in the world, and that George Bush was going to be a brave fighter against the gay agenda, and definitely in terms of like gender and sexuality, like, oh wow, did that give me some baggage? I think. Especially like, even hearing that. And so I was like, well, if being gay is that evil, like how horrible must I be as like a trans person? Because like, they don't even talk about that. Like, that must be even worse. And like, I remember, when I was Ask Jeevesing or using other such pre-Google search engines, looking up like transgender Christians, and, I found that there were like some others, and I was like, oh, wow, maybe this is like a thing. But like, then like my evangelical mind was like, no, they're not real Christians. Like, they've given up on the real gospel and they're heretics. And, I think that so much of that baggage has still stuck with me. And like, I think, like looking at my, desire to be like this very out trans woman Christian, and like I was for a little bit actively really trying to become like a head pastor sort of person. I think so much of it was trying to prove like, yeah, I can be trans and a Christian, because I had all this baggage of like, no, you can't. And I mean, and in terms of gender itself, like, we definitely, I had so many friends like and always talking to me about like the I Kiss dating goodbye and stuff, and giving me grief when I actually did start dating. Like, no, you should be doing courtship, and all these crazy things. And it's just, like I feel like there's just times where I just discover like deep hidden things of like how evangelicalism is like still in the back of my mind, or influencing the way I think about something, like, especially so much guilt. And I think like even there's a sense that, even like, having my fancy new theological education, that in the back of my mind, there's part of me that's like, well, what if I'm going to hell? Like, what if I'm actually all wrong about this? And all of these evangelicals that, brainwashed me as a as a child. What if they, what if they're actually right and I really am just going to hell? And then I'm like, well, I guess it's worth it. Because I really don't want to be in evangelical circles anymore. So I'm good with that. I still, as misguided as I think evangelicals are, like, I don't say they're not Christians. Like, they're Christians. They're horribly misguided. And I think they have some absolutely horrible theology that's damaging to people's lives. But I wouldn't go so far as to be like, they're not Christians. Whereas in the reverse, an evangelical person for 99% of the time is not going to give me that same benefit. They're going to say I'm an apostate and that I believe not real Christianity and that I've been lied to, sort of thing. In the UCC, is probably like the devil's denomination or something. But and that was basically what I told her. I was like, it's really hard to be nice to evangelicals when they're not particularly nice to me. So yeah, I mean, growing up as a trans woman in evangelical background, it's I think luckily during my time at Chicago Theological Seminary, I finally started unpacking that a little bit more and kind of moving past it and the influence that it had. But yeah, so that's my gut reactions about evangelicalism and sexuality and gender identity, is that it can be really, really damaging.
Yeah, well, like Matt said before, thanks for sharing that part of your story as well. So it's kind of awkward to ask people, like, hey, can you tell us about this really rough time that you had? But I'm really thankful that you did. I really appreciate that part of the story, especially. And I guess as we pivot to talking a little bit more about communism, maybe I want to talk a little bit more about that, if that's fine with you, specifically talking about how, Christianity has a weird history with LGBT folks, but so does communism. I was just thinking about here in Toronto, I have a trans Christian friend who used to be a member of a communist group in the city decades ago, but left because that group was really transphobic at the time. But nowadays, that same friend of mine is back hanging around with those that communist group today, because at least the way that they describe it is that the younger communists seem to sort of understand that trans people should be welcome in that struggle, but this same friend doesn't really like hanging out with some of the older communists who still hang around there. So I guess I'm curious to hear, how have you navigated some of those tensions, or have you even, encountered them? And also, bonus question, why are TERFs so bad?
Okay, we can get to that one in a second, because the first part's got plenty enough to go off of. Kind of related to what I was already just talking about with evangelicalism there, is I think part of my journey to communism was kind of spurred on by the same feelings as like moving towards like a more open Christianity, because I spent my entire young life being told like, these aren't real Christians, like they've given up on the real gospel. And like once I actually encountered LGBT affirming Christians and LGBT Christians, I was like, wait, what? Like this was, I was clearly lied to. So I think much of that same sort of feeling was like, once I started interacting with communist theory, that I was like, well, maybe I was lied to, because I first dabbled in any communist theory. I don't even know how it happened, but I interlibrary loaned a book written by Trotsky in my time at Kuyper, and I will forever be thankful to the librarian for not being like, what? And I read that and I was like, okay, well, this isn't quite what I was told about like communism. And I was like, but this is Trotsky and he must have been the real communist, unlike all these people who betrayed communism. But we'll get to that later. And then I briefly dabbled in like the whole Occupy thing. I went down to like the first night of Occupy Grand Rapids, which unfortunately was, as white as Grand Rapids is. And they occupied an area that's kind of known for being, a little bit like sacred to Native cultures. And it was on the weekend of like Columbus Day. So, really tasteful, let's occupy the Native space on Columbus Day. That's just a really winning combination. But at the same time, I wanted to get involved because I was like, okay, there needs to be real change. Because I had like loved Obama in 2008, and by 2011, I'm like, what the heck? This is, not what I was sold about politics changing and the world becoming better. And so I was intrigued by the whole more radical things. And at the same time, I was also like really truly coming out of the closet by then. And like we had like an event related with Occupy that was called like Tranarchy, I think was the name. It was about like trans people and radical thought, and it was really interesting stuff. But like Occupy Grand Rapids fizzled out. Obviously, Occupy fizzled out. Then I was still just like interested in all this, but like I didn't really know where to head with it. It really wasn't until Twitter that luckily gave me a little push towards like, here's some things to read. But like for me, diving into like left book Twitter, communist Twitter, left Twitter, I thought it was a pretty open space in terms of LGBT issues, and like obviously there's baggage regarding the history and stuff, but like I definitely, when I was first diving in and everything, I really felt no issue diving into communist organizing as a trans woman. Like it seemed pretty open, and I knew lots of other trans women that were communists. And whereas like I felt like being in the church, like even like being at affirming churches just sometimes feels like such a battle. I know there was a article, like a satire article going around that talks about the trans woman who goes to the other side of the street because she doesn't want like the group of self-affirming liberals to all spend forever telling her how beautiful she is and how great it is that she's challenging gender and stuff. And it's like, even in like the most affirming churches, it still felt like that, like me being trans was still just like the prime focus of everything. And like I always had to be explaining it and be like this poster icon for transness, and I had to be the perfect example. And like so I got a job as a youth pastor at a church that I had helped in the process of them becoming open and affirming. Like I came and spoke about trans issues, and they voted to become open and affirming. And I got a job there as a youth pastor for the high schoolers. And as soon as like I started actually transitioning on the job, suddenly all these people that were like, well, I can be sort of okay with it. Like once it was actually like a real thing, they weren't okay with it, and they lost members. And then like they kept me on, but in the end I got let go because of budget issues, which I'm making lots of air quotes on my end here. But so basically, because of the funding they lost, because people left because of me, they cut my position, which was like 3% of the total budget, and not like the newer person who had been hired, who was like 10% of the budget. Lots of feelings there that, I felt like that was such a moment that I was like, even in these churches that say they're affirming, like, is it really going to be affirming? Am I still going to have to just fight to exist? Like, sure, there's been some learning moments in communist organizing, but as far as being a trans woman, but like I don't feel like I've ever had to quite like fight for my right to exist. Perhaps because other communist trans people have already made that fight in the past, but like, still a lot of negative feelings for me thinking about like the fact that in most churches, I still felt like I had to fight for my right to exist, and that I always had to be hyper visible to be valid as like a trans woman Christian. Like I had to be the example for everybody and show them that trans people are normal too, sort of thing. So, I think I felt very welcomed in radical organizing, and I've had so many struggles in Christian churches and organizations that it makes it hard to even like have trust anymore. I think because it just it's so many times of the church screwing you over that you just kind of give up at some point. Like maybe other people have kept pushing on and didn't give up, but I just was like, you know what? I'm tired of having to do this.
Again, thanks for just giving us all of this. It's so cool to hear. But now we're going to make a really sort of on-brand, patented Magnificast transition into talking about something a little bit different. It's a transition because I'm saying it very explicitly. There's you can't. You're not wondering. It's just that's what we're doing. We're transitioning to this other sort of thing. So
transitioning is my expertise.
Oh, geez, I didn't even realize that was. Oh my god, I'm so dumb.
You mess up.
Yeah. Man.
It's the trans episode, so it's just really natural that we have a huge transition.
Cool. Whoa. I'm so oblivious to the things I'm saying. Walking into these things. Okay. Well, anyways, speaking of Twitter, I suppose.
The transition is getting worse.
I know. It's even worse now. Dean, save me from this hell that I've put myself in.
Okay. Yeah, here we go. This is the divine judgment coming to rescue everyone and release us from this terrible fate. All right. So speaking of Twitter, as Matt was saying, your brand is being like very into communism, which is very good. And I know you've been moving away from certain Christian expressions, and earlier you said, you're on kind of a theology hiatus right now. But nevertheless, I'd be really interested to hear, how do you square that communism with your Christian faith? How do you own that Christianity, like you were talking about earlier, and also kind of own that political heritage that you're, still exploring and really pursuing actively? How do those things go together?
Yeah. There's all sorts of insights. But my Twitter brand, I don't know that I'd call it a brand, but I suppose being really, really into communism would be an accurate representation. I've tried to make communist LinkedIn happen, but everybody has failed to follow me there to the beauty of organizing on LinkedIn. Because I know there's a left book, which I kind of sometimes dabble in, but mostly just avoid. And there's obviously left Twitter and communist Twitter and tanky Twitter and all these, a million different aspects of Twitter. But we're really missing this undervalued potential of communist organizing on LinkedIn. At the very least, it provides us a really easy list of managers, CEOs, gets them all in one place. But anyways, so, once upon a time, I was just an innocent little Ember Kelly 39 on Twitter. And just talked about trans issues and trying to be a trans woman pursuing a call to ministry. And as I said, it eventually turned into just communism nonstop. It's been quite the journey. I think there's a lot of amazing insights to be offered about organizing and looking at history and looking at, there's so many things that we could dive into that we'll kind of leave for specific questions. But, I think for me, it was a natural flow. I recently spent some time hanging out with Roland Bohr, and we both share that Reformed background. And I said, well, Reformed people, they either become universalists, they become the hyper conservative Reformed people who, think about whether God damned everyone to hell before or after the fall. Then the other option is that Reformed people become communists. Because it seems like those are the main three options that I ever see happening. And so, I think for a lot of it felt like a really natural flow. But then obviously there was so much baggage between the two because religion has been such a tool for reaction, and especially reaction against communist parties, communist government, communist organizing. And communism has, for good reason, often been quite suspicious about Christianity. So, I think it's logically thinking, analyzing the world, it seemed like a really natural place to go. But then I had to really work through what exactly does that mean? How do you deal with these sorts of things? And I think that, for at this point, I'm not quite sure sometimes. But I think for the longest time, at the beginning, it was just like, oh, well, I'm a religious person who just happens to be slightly interested in communism and like the insights it could offer into theology. I think that was a few years of just like kind of looking at it, but then like headed to try and more fully integrate it, and did a lot of like writing during my time at CTS, the good CTS, not Calvin Seminary, but my time at Chicago Seminary. But so I think that, you know, it was a really, there was lots to be looked at, because I mean, liberation theology already provides like a really solid background to me in terms of thinking about like Marxism and religion. But, you know, I think that due to like the reactionary forces that many of those people were often up against, they often like hesitated to fully call themselves communists, or to like fully make the jump to like joining a party, because they were, it was just not possible for them, sort of thing. Or they were afraid to, perhaps. So for me, it was like, okay, well, I really want to dive in and actually think like, what would a truly communist theology look like? And I did my whole thesis about that, and like I looked at like post-colonial theory, and I looked at queer theory and theology, and I looked at Roland Bohr's books, and I wrote what I thought was like this most beautiful 100-page thesis, to which I unfortunately only received passing and not passing with distinction, and I'm still very bitter about that one. But so I wrote this whole big thesis, and now like already I'm like, is it actually any good? You know, but I suppose that's the life of being somewhat academic, is automatically thinking that your work is absolute shit after you've already finished it. And so I think, you know, more the direction that I've been headed recently is kind of thinking about like, you know, moving, not just like mixing the theology and the communism together into like a little, you know, Harry Potter potion or something, but trying to think like realistically, think materialistically about like what does religion, what does Christianity specifically look like when it is, you know, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, when it is people-centered, when it is people-focused, you know, what would that difference be? Because like even in so many of the really radical Christian churches that I've been in, they still rely on like a couple really, really rich donors to keep that church going, who still have some fairly conservative views. Like, so how do you truly move to like people-focused religion? Like, what does that look like? What will that look like? How do religious people get involved in radical organizing? Because I think, you know, it's really easy for Christians to take over everything. It's kind of what we do. Like, you know, I see radical movements, and then like Christians automatically got to be like, oh, well, I got to go be there. I got to go be present with the people, but I still really want to lead everything. Like, how do Christians, how do specifically like ministers, how do religious people not just like come in and take over and try and run things their own way, but instead, you know, how do we listen to the people? How do we change our theology to be more people-centered, and to be more focused on like the material struggles and the material reality of people's lives?
Well, on that point of sort of like interacting with the world, and how that's been a pretty important piece to kind of take a step back from your work, which I totally get. In light of all that, following you on social media, I've just kind of seen some of your more interesting travels. You've been in Vietnam and in China, and doing some cool stuff. Kind of struck me as something that was a little bit funny. I mean, it's like a really interesting thing to do, go live somewhere else, and I think that's awesome. But like reactionaries are like always telling leftists that, you know, if you don't like capitalism, you should just move to China or something. And it seems like you're someone who took that advice a little bit more seriously than the rest of us. So what have you learned? What kind of like judgments would you make about living in communist countries, or could you name a few
Yeah.
things that you were like impressed by, and maybe some things that you might have been put off by, or whatever? What are the ups and downs of it?
Yeah, so many. So this could be the entire podcast in itself. So I after I finished seminary, so to back it up a little bit, during my final year, I started talking about doing a PhD about Marxism and theology in China. Like, the specific topic was that I was going to look at the works of Liu Shaoqi, especially like How to Be a Good Communist, and think about self-cultivation and like how that's present in like Asian thought in general, like Asian religions, how that's present in Christianity, and kind of bring all those together to think about like ethics and think about how we act and how we need to cultivate ourselves. So very, very theological. So we put in the whole application and got everything going, and like they considered it, but they decided that I needed to be fluent in Mandarin to be able to do the PhD. And so I was like, in the meanwhile, while I had been applying, I had started researching getting like a TESOL certificate because I figured if I was going to be studying abroad for a PhD, that I could at least get the certificate and maybe make a little money on the side while doing the program, like teaching English, doing lessons for people. So I was like, well, it seems a worthwhile investment. And I found a program that operates out of Ho Chi Minh City and out of Hanoi in Vietnam. And I was like, oh, cool, even better, because like Ho Chi Minh is up there in terms of like my favorite thinkers. So I was like, okay, well, this is great. Like, I get my opportunity to go study in Vietnam and get to be there for a little while and then go off and do my PhD in China. But then I got the rejection for the PhD, and I was like, okay, well, we're gonna just go enjoy Vietnam then, and start with teaching English and then see where it goes. So we sold our house, which was pretty great because we had bought it when the market was a little bit lower, and we made enough money to pay off some of our student loans. Unfortunately, we still have a giant ton of them. We came over in July to Hanoi, and then literally while I was on the flight to Hanoi, I had done an interview for a job in China, and I got the offer for this international kindergarten. I got the offer while we were flying in the air to Hanoi. And so I was like, okay, well, we'll just head to China once my course is done, sort of thing. Bureaucracy is a bit of a mess because it ended up taking a little bit longer. We ended up in Hanoi for 3 months. My course was like the first month, and we thought we were going to be headed there in like early to China in early September. But paperwork got held up in the U.S., and then visa process took forever in Hanoi for China, and it was just a little bit of a pain. So we didn't make it to China now until just about exactly 1 month ago. It was October 17 that we got here. So it's been really great. Like you said, I decided to take everyone's advice and come to a communist country. I probably could have done Cuba because it was closer to Michigan, but wasn't quite sure I was ready for tropical Caribbean weather. I'd been to the Dominican Republic once, and that weather did not really agree with me. So I was like, Cuba's probably not my cup of tea. But yeah, Vietnam was really great. It was a bit easier to adjust to than China has been so far. I think that there's a lot more expats that live in Hanoi, so there's a little bit more like Western-ish kind of stuff. So it made it a little bit easier of an adjustment, whereas China's definitely been an adjustment, getting used to new things and new ways of doing things. It's been really amazing. Like the development, the seeing. It's hard to put into words, but just like seeing that the people. I don't know. Maybe I guess it would be in comparison to like thinking about the United States, where I think, you know, that so many people in the US in terms of like just engaging the world around them is like really negative and really like there's no hope, or, you know, on one end, like the immigrants are stealing our jobs, and on the other end, like, let's just burn down the whole country sort of radicalism. And like, you know, there's not much hope, but like, you know, I like immediately got the feeling in Vietnam and in China that like people are excited, like they're excited about what the future holds. They're excited for the developments. They're excited for it just seemed much more people focused, people powered, that people felt empowered to kind of make their own way, whereas in the US I just didn't recently ever have that feeling. And you know, I think you know, I'm not going to lie that seeing all the hammers and sickles everywhere isn't wonderful, but you know, I don't want anybody accusing me of being like the red flag flying is all it takes to be a communist. But like, I think it's, you know, it's been really exciting to see it up close. Like, you know, as much as, yes, it's a market economy, like it's still, like if you've studied about it, like and it feels different in person. Like you could definitely just come and be like, oh yeah, this is exactly the same as the US, but it's not. And I mean, that's hard to explain. I've tried to think through it of how to explain it exactly, but it hasn't really happened. But it just, it feels different. And especially like looking at like the cost of things, looking at the focus on providing lots of affordable housing, like it's just such different development focuses, such different where money is going focuses, that it's about making life easier for people. It's about making sure that people can afford things, making sure that healthcare is easy and good and affordable to everybody, making sure that everybody can eat, you know, affordably and not like be starving, making sure that education is good, like the funding is going towards good stuff. Like I found out in China that they actually have like a rule that that a community, if a school is like charging too expensive, like a private school is charging too expensive fees, like the community can actually like vote to take away their certificate. Like it's, you know, that's pretty badass. Yeah. Like there's just these everyday little things that I notice, and like, you know, they actually spend money on like providing good public transit. They, you know, the development, everything just actually seems focused on like actually getting down to everybody in society. Like even like in Vietnam, like, you know, like we lived near like a little tiny market. It wasn't like some big, huge market, and it wasn't like a huge tourist hotspot. But like, you know, there was a little lady that just like carried the food around like on the typical, I can't remember what it's called, but like just carried around food to sell it sort of thing. And I see her just like pull out a smartphone, and I'm just like, what? Like everybody has smartphones. You know, just like, it seems like, yeah, it's definitely got its contradictions of being a socialist oriented market economy. But that it just seems very much like the development is focused on helping everybody as a whole, helping the people, helping the least in society to, you know, poverty alleviation, things like that. It's just a much bigger, real concern for like economics over here. So it's been cool to just see in person. And like, I'm not going to lie that it wasn't also really cool to, you know, go see Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum. So I got to be, you know, up close and personal with Ho Chi Minh's body. It was only like 5 feet away with guards and stuff in front of it, but it was still really cool. And like, you know, it was just like a random Thursday in the middle of September. I don't even remember what day it was. It was like a day that had no consequence to it, and there was probably still like 1,000 people there to come see his body that morning. Like, it was just, you know, it was cool to see that he still means so much to so many people. And like in the city that we're in, Changsha is it's in the same vicinity as Chairman Mao's birthplace, and so like there's a big mountain that they built actually out of concrete that's like got his face on it, and like they got like a poem that he wrote about Changsha like actually like inscribed on like this big stone, and it was really cool to go see. And it turns out it's actually really close to Liu Shaoqi's birthplace, and I'm hoping to make it there since he's my hashtag favorite.
That's really amazing. I mean, you spent all this time in communist countries now, and not just thinking about communism, but actually living in it. So I guess our good sign-off question for you would be, why should Christians be communists?
Oh yeah, that definitely could be a long-winded question. Okay. Why should Christians be communists? Why shouldn't they? There's my hot take. Christians should be a communist because they should give a shit about the actual world. We're already seeing huge effects of climate change. We're already seeing the rise of fascism in most of these neoliberal Western democracies. Like, shit is hitting the fan. Why shouldn't Christians be communists? It's time to step it up. But I think that, in short, that Christians need to understand materialism. Like they need to interact with the world. They need to interact with concrete things, and they need to understand that like people are suffering through very real issues in their lives. Like, and that we need to address that as Christians. That we need to. I'm thinking of the Magnificat. I almost just called it the Magnificast. But thinking of casting down the mighty and lifting up the lowly. Christianity can be such a tool for reaction, but we shouldn't let it be. There's centuries of radical Christians trying to push back against it just being used. I worry that if we don't fight back for the soul of Christianity as something radical, or if we don't show that Christianity can truly mean something to the world, that we're losing something. And then I think that Christians are really missing out if they don't take a look at revolutionary socialism, at Marxism, Leninism, as a way of beginning to think about like what it actually means to put the people into power, what it actually means to move from being something that's just like a social club to moving to be something that's truly changing the world. So I think that's my attempt at a condensed take on that one.
It's a good take.
It's good. Yeah. You did it.
Okay, I try.
Well, thanks a lot for coming on the show, Ember. It was really hard for us to all work out our 3 different time zones, but I'm really happy that it all panned out.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/The Magnificast. Follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, join our Facebook group, The Magnificast Basement. That's important. Hey, take Dean's class. Sign up. It's not very expensive even. It's really... I mean, you don't want to advertise your sort of like educational program as being of good value, but it is, because it's like $90 in Canada, and that's pretty good for a grad seminar. So, I don't know. Do it. Take it.
Yeah, watch the exchange rates for the next few days. This is how I live my life. Watch the exchange rates for the next few days. Decide when the optimal time is to spend your American dollars on a Canadian thing, and then jump on it. If you're in Canada, then just spend your regular old money and don't watch the exchange rate, because you might feel a little bit bad about how far your dollar stretches. It's a pretty cool class, I think. I'm really excited to teach it. It's 13 weeks. And here's a couple of highlights. You're going to learn about a wild Catholic poet who joined the Communist Party of Canada, and he became the most famous poet in China and the USSR. You get to learn about a priest who was there at the founding of the IWW. You get to learn about what Huey P. Newton said about how Black Panthers should join the church. Lots and lots of good Christians. All your faves are here. and it's going to be a really exciting kind of broad class looking specifically at like the history of movements more so than the kind of theoretical exchanges between theologians or philosophers, as important as they are. So if you're interested in seeing some kind of on the ground stuff, get into it.
You know, most podcasts, when they get kind of popular, they just make a book. But look, you made a class. You made a whole educational situation that people can engage in. So there you go. Taking a sort of different approach to this whole podcast business.
Yeah, this is the new revolutionary approach. Move over, Chapo. We're teaching a class.
You can also download our ebook, 33 Ways to Make Your Dumb Podcast Appeal to People on the Internet. Start a class about it.
33, one for each year of Jesus' life before he entered adult ministry.
Oh man, I didn't even think about that. I'm full of...
That's the product tie-in.
I'm full of bad, weird jokes I'm backing my way into tonight.
Matt, okay, let me take one quick minute.
Yeah.
That transition you did, you were doing a great job.
Yeah, thank
you. You know, yeah, you're a sweet boy, and you were just trying your sweetest job to be a sweet boy, and I hope that everybody sees that.
Yup. Okay, cool. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast again. Intro music is by Amari Armstrong, and I love it. And it's so good, and I love them beats. And the outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. I also love that song. Never get tired of listening to either of them, honestly. So cool. Thank you for all this good music, people that have contributed it. All right, see you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.